Hey everyone, welcome back to Critical Thinking in the Age of AI. This is just a repository for my voice notes. I know, not another podcast. No, we're just going to be just having a straightforward conversation about AI, the humanities, and the future of work. So, today, I wanted to talk about something that just went into effect on January 1st, 2026, and that is California's AI Data Transparency Act. And stick with me because it isn't just about legal compliance or corporate paperwork, because I know some of you are probably taking off your headphones right now. But listen, I really believe this is fundamentally about whether we get to understand the systems that are increasingly making decisions about our lives. So here's the question I want you to sit with. If AI is going to help decide whether you get a loan, whether you get hired, what information you see, how should we be able to audit those decisions? So let me tell you what this law actually does. So the California AI Data Transparency Act requires AI companies that do business in California to publicly disclose detailed information about the data sets they use to train their generative AI systems. And I'm going to read you the actual requirements because I think the specificity here matters. So companies must disclose, just high level, because if I read all 12/15 of them, you're gonna take your headphones off. But basically a detailed summary of the data sets used, including their sources and methodologies, the total number of data points or tokens, like the small unit of input in each data set, whether the data sets include any copyrighted works, personal information, or data protected by other legal rights. That's important. A description of how copyrighted or protected materials were identified, handled, and whether permission was obtained. Information about data curation, cleaning, and labeling processes, any known limitations, biases, or potential harms associated with the data set. So, okay, this is a lot. So this has to be made publicly available on their websites and updated regularly. Now, some of you might be thinking, okay, well, this seems reasonable. Yeah, and yet xAI, Elon Musk's company, which is actually headquartered in California, has filed a lawsuit challenging this law. Why? Well, let's look at what xAI themselves are actually arguing in their lawsuit, because their reasoning, I think, in many ways, tells us a lot about how AI companies think about data and competition and things of that sort. Okay, so I am going to read from the official complaint that was filed. I am reading from pages 3 through 4. Now, pay attention. It says, quote, if a competitor had insight into any of those aspects of the datasets, it could replicate the training process and undercut its rival's competitive edge. For example, if OpenAI, another leading AI company, were to discover that xAI was using an important dataset to train its models that OpenAI was not, OpenAI would almost certainly acquire that dataset to train its own model and vice versa. At bottom, these datasets are valuable precisely because they are not public. The datasets themselves and their usage are valuable trade secrets. End quote. So let me pretty much summarize this. So they're basically arguing that the specific data sets, even the combination, how they're curated, how they're cleaned, how they're weighted, all those different stuff is like their Krusty Krab formula. Hello, SpongeBob. It's like their secret sauce, and if a competitor were to figure out, the components of that sauce, so to speak, then they would basically lose their competitive edge, right? They've also raised in the complaint some First Amendment concerns, arguing that you know, being forced to disclose that data is a form of, quote, compelled speech. I highly recommend you read the National Law Review's reporting on this case. I think it was really helpful for me. And in many ways, I just want to be clear, I'm in no way a legal expert on this. And I'll go into my, critical philosophical ramblings on all of this quite soon. But if you do have a law background, I would actually love to hear your perspective on this, because according to the Institute for Law and AI, Anthropic and OpenAI have already published their required disclosures. I mean, I haven't read them, but I think that's quite interesting that xAI is so far, I believe, the only one filing this lawsuit. I think, what's fascinating overall about these arguments from more so a philosophical standpoint is that they're essentially saying that the process of building AI, what data you train on and how you handle it, is itself proprietary knowledge that must be protected. But that raises, I think, for me at least, a deeper question. At what point, hear me out, does a system become so embedded in society that we, the public, have a right to understand it, regardless of competitive concerns, right? And let's zoom out for a second, because I think the real importance of this law and the real stakes of this lawsuit go way beyond the specifics of, data transparency. This is fundamentally an epistemological issue, right? A question about how we know what we know, and whether, hear me out, we can trust the systems increasingly embedded in critical aspects of our society. Like, think about it. These AI systems are becoming infrastructure, right? They're not just novelty chatbots anymore. Let's be honest with ourselves here. They're helping, for example, screen job applications. They're being integrated into healthcare diagnostics. They're influencing educational assessments. They're shaping what information billions of people see online. And here's the thing. They are essentially like black boxes, right? That's a nervous laugh because I know you can't see my face right now. Even the engineers who build these models often can't fully explain why a model produces a specific output, right? And I don't know, that's the nature of neural networks at this scale, quite honestly. But if we can't peek inside the algorithm itself, shouldn't we at least be able to examine what went into training it? I don't know, thinking out loud here once again. But as a humanist, what I care about most really is like, what is the real human impact, right? When an AI system denies someone a loan, or screens out their resume, or recommends content that radicalizes them, we need to be able to ask, what assumptions were baked into the system from the very beginning, i.e., training data, right? What biases existed in the training data? What perspectives were included or excluded, right? Because when we evaluate these systems and the decisions they're making, we need to understand the limits of their, quote, knowledge, right? What they were trained on, what they weren't exposed to, and where their blind spots, so to speak, might be. And hear me out. I'm trying not to yap, but here's the deeper question that keeps me up at night sometimes. When these systems replicate human biases, and they do, we need to think critically about alignment. We always talk about wanting, AI systems to be aligned, but aligned with what? Aligned with whom, right? Because clearly, not all humans agree on certain things. Not all humans are aligned on these issues. So to which human or to which group of people are these systems being aligned, such that everyone else will essentially be forced to adapt to that worldview, right? And these are like the big questions I think we all just need to sit with, like, who gets to decide what aligned means. And if we can't even see what data shaped these systems, how can we have that conversation? So I don't know, like, here's a question for you. What level of transparency do you think we're entitled to as a society when it comes to AI systems that affect our lives, right? Yeah. So yeah, drop your thoughts and stuff like that, and answers in the comments. If you're watching on YouTube, would love to hear from you. But now there's another dimension to this that's worth understanding. And I think this connects to something I've written about extensively, which is my AI collapse thesis, which if you haven't read it or watched it, it's available to you on YouTube and in my newsletter. But here's the uncomfortable truth that's been circulating in AI circles for a while now. These companies are running out of high quality training data. I mean, they've essentially scraped the accessible internet like clean, right? And the demand for data keeps growing as models get bigger and more capable. And this creates a fascinating competitive dynamic. These data sets have really become incredibly valuable. I mean, arguably the most valuable asset these companies have besides the models themselves. At least that's what I'm arguing. Once again, feel free to read it on my newsletter and watch the video on YouTube. But here's where I think it gets interesting. The industry knows they have a data problem, and they're also exploring multiple solutions, and I'll cover some of them here right now. So, for example, there are architecture changes, right? So I believe, actually, I still need to read the paper, but I started to see the reports of it. But I believe companies like DeepSeek, right, have recently published research on making models more data efficient. So like getting better performance with less training data by fundamentally changing how the models are structured, like the actual architecture of it, right? Another option is like, instead of massive general purpose models, so think like Claude or ChatGPT, we might see more small specialized models that are fine-tuned for specific tasks, or like RAG systems, that stands for retrieval augmented generation, RAG systems. Essentially, it's like where models pull from like curated knowledge bases rather than relying solely on training data, right? Of course, there's also like synthetic data. I don't know, this is a bit controversial, right? Because of like the model collapse problem. So when AI generated data gets fed back into training future models, you can get this like degradation effect. Essentially, it's like making a copy of a copy, right? And then the errors just like compound and stuff like that. But I don't know, some researchers think that the careful use of synthetic data might work, but okay, essentially, sorry, try not to yap, guys. The point is, we're at this inflection point where the infinite scaling paradigm that got us here might be running into very hard limits, right? And that makes the transparency question even more important, because we need to understand what these systems were trained on before we lose the ability to trace their lineage. Okay, so what does all this mean? What should we be thinking about as this lawsuit unfolds and as AI systems become more embedded in our lives? Here's what I keep coming back to, right? Transparency isn't just about accountability, though that matters. That's very important. Don't hear me wrong. That's very important. I think it's also about maintaining the ability to ask meaningful questions about the systems shaping our world, right? So when California regulates tech, the effects often ripple outwards. Let's be honest, right? Companies frequently apply California standards more broadly, rather than, trying to maintain different systems for different jurisdictions. So I think this lawsuit matters beyond California's borders. But beyond the legal specifics of it, I think we need to sit with some very serious tensions here, right? So there's a real tension between innovation incentives and public understanding, right? There's a tension between competitive advantage and public oversight. And there's a tension between treating AI as a product versus treating it as infrastructure. That's very important. And maybe, just maybe, we don't need to resolve these tensions immediately, So maybe the point is to hold them, to think critically about them, to have ongoing conversations about where we draw these lines. Because as someone with a humanities background, what I keep coming back to is this: technology isn't neutral. Every AI system embodies choices about what matters, whose perspectives count, what problems are worth solving. That's a huge thing. Why are we getting AI generated videos before AI solves, other big critical problems or actual problems, And ultimately, if those choices I just talked about are completely opaque, I don't know. I think we lose our ability to collectively interrogate them. And here's another question for you to sit with, because I know I just threw a lot at you all. How do you think we should balance corporate innovation with public transparency? Is there even a middle ground? What would that look like? I'm genuinely curious, because there's a broad spectrum of nerds. I'm joking. It's a broad spectrum. I'm not joking. You guys are actually really smart. And I really love chatting about this stuff. But quite honestly, it's a broad spectrum of people: technologists, humanists, people, from all different industries and sectors and levels of interest that listen to this and engage with my content. So I'm genuinely curious, what you think. So comment below wherever you're listening. And love to hear your thoughts. But look, I know regulations and transparency requirements and lawsuits are not the sexiest podcast/voice note topics, but these are ultimately the foundational questions about how AI gets integrated into society. Who gets to know what? Who bears the risk? Who benefits? Whose values get encoded into systems that affect all of us, right? And that brings me back to really, I guess the mission of this podcast, right, is giving you a sense of understanding and agency about our collective AI future. And I think that starts with really understanding what's happening, asking better questions, thinking critically about the assumptions embedded in the technologies shaping our world. So yeah, okay, that's enough yapping. So if you found this episode valuable, please rate it 5 stars wherever you're listening. It really does help other people find it. And share it with someone who may be interested in asking and thinking about these questions. Follow me on YouTube, subscribe to my newsletter, and let's keep this conversation going. Because ultimately, truly, I believe the future isn't something that just happens to us. It's something we have the power to shape through the questions we ask and the conversations we have. So, thanks for thinking critically with me today. And I'll see you in the next episode.